we have learned nothing this week, we have certainly learned that the Spanish came in and took the Southwest, what we refer to as the American Southwest, from the local indigenous people, and made it part of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And the Spanish Empire ruled that until 1821. And at that point, the newly independent Mexican government controls the bulk of the region until after the Mexican-American War in 1848. So we're going to look at the fur trade under both countries' jurisdiction and how, following Mexico's independence from Spain, and particularly under the administration of Governor Bartolomé Baca, that the fur trade initially thrives under this new government. And that success was due in large part to French, Creole, and Métis lineage men who were prepared to boldly venture into this unfamiliar region seeking their profits. Now, the Spanish regime was very exclusionary in its approach to its North American holdings. The economic lifelines ran, here's Santa Fe, way up here. And all of the trade from this period came from Chihuahua, Durango, Mexico City, and Veracruz. So, and that was Spanish rule. There was no outsiders, no foreigners were allowed. The El Camino Real, as we have learned, is about 1,600 miles down to Mexico City, and then it's another couple of hundred miles over to Veracruz, which was the main port during the Spanish time. The Santa Fe Trail, when it opens up, is less than half of that. So this 1,600 to 1,800 mile trade route makes importing goods into the Santa Fe provinces very expensive. But all trade was required to be conducted within the boundaries of the Spanish Empire at that time. The Tejanos over in Texas weren't allowed to trade with the French in Louisiana. The Californios were prohibited from trading with the British and American merchant ships that were coasting along the Pacific shores. But French merchants in upper Louisiana had long hoped to supply New Mexicans with manufactured goods in exchange for horses and silver dollars, despite Spain's barring of foreign trade. Spanish regulations kept that commerce out of bounds for most Louisiana vendors. The few trading parties that were audacious enough to enter New Mexico were arrested and their goods confiscated. For example, as far back as 1742, a party of 9 Frenchmen led by Louis Marie penetrated to Taos, where they were seized by Spanish authorities and taken to Santa Fe. There, Marie was shot in the plaza. 7 of the men were allowed to return to their own country, but one, who's identified in the archives as Juan de Alary, remained in Santa Fe, where he married, had a family, and became a man of substance. Now, once France ceded Louisiana to Spain in 1762, the northern districts of New Mexico were regarded more as a buffer zone to check French, British, and American encroachment from the east and northeast. These provinces were sparsely populated, and the economics were heavily regulated. Now, in regard to furs, the Spanish crown had focused on the mineral resources of its colonies rather than on peltry for decades. Limited fur trading had occurred between settlers of Spain's northern colonies and local Indian tribes, but rather than fine furs that were sought by the Americans, the Spanish had traditionally pursued elk, antelope, deer, and bison robes. Using Catholic missions as trading posts to distribute goods, several early Spanish governors had attempted to profit from a local Indian trade in these coarse furs, including a failed attempt to market bison wool. Ultimately, commerce in furs was virtually dismissed, primarily due to the high cost of exporting the product and a strong desire to hunt mineral resources instead, mainly gold and silver. At the turn of the 19th century, the population of Santa Fe was nearly 5,000 people, and that provided a viable economic target. So when the United States purchased Louisiana in 1803, though positioned for commerce, Spain was just as unwelcoming as she had been to the French. 1 year later, the first Spanish governor, who was named Charles de la Sousse, he was born in Lille, France, so he was French, but yet the Spanish lieutenant governor, he warned that if greater precautions were not taken to stop the illegal American traders, within a short time, he said, one will see descending the Missouri, instead of furs, silver from the mines of Mexico. That's de la Sousse. This untapped asset of fine furs had not gone unnoticed by Americans. During the early 1800s, several American parties ventured into Spanish lands, expecting to exploit a virtually untouched beaver resource, but each met with only marginal success before being intercepted by authorities. De la Souce knew that Baptiste Lalande and his partner Jeannot Matoyer, as well as Laurent Durocher and Jacques d'Église, were putting together expeditions headed to New Mexico. These 4 traders were all Frenchmen, though now they were U.S. citizens due to the transfer of Louisiana. Baptiste Lalande's story is particularly interesting. He was hired by William Morrison of Kaskaskia, Illinois in 1804 and sent to Santa Fe with a stock of merchandise. He managed to sell them, apparently for quite a large profit, but he seems to have liked the climate, and so the idea of hazarding such a long and perilous journey through savage lands merely to give his boss his money seemed a bit rash. He decided to stay in New Mexico and to use his newfound capital and trade for himself, and soon became quite a prosperous citizen of New Mexico. Now, the first United States government-sponsored foray into Spanish lands, though not specifically for peltry, was the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1804 and 06. While planning this significant mission to determine the best route to the Pacific coast, President Thomas Jefferson informed Spanish authorities that the upcoming quest would be crossing their lands and asked permission for an American Army brigade to go across the Spanish soil. Jefferson assured the foreign minister, Carlos Martinez, that the expedition had, quote, no other view than the advancement of geography. We couldn't trust presidents then here, could we? Skeptical, Martinez refused to grant passports, although France and Great Britain, whose territories would also be traversed by this same tour, did so with little opposition. There's Mr. Martinez. Now, Spain's bone of contention was that France had sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803, but the terms of agreement left the sale's western boundary in dispute. The territory was to include those lands drained by the Mississippi River and its territories, which includes the Red and the Arkansas. And you can see how those overlap what Spain thought was theirs and had been for centuries. News that a U.S. military unit would be mapping its lands did not sit well with the Spanish government, and no less than 4 different parties of Spanish soldiers marched north from Santa Fe to intercept Captain Merritt, though none accomplished their purpose. About the time of Lewis and Clark's return, Lieutenant Zebulon Pike left St. Louis. That was in July of 1806. He was to explore the sources of the Arkansas and Red Rivers. He and his men headed south, following a trail made by Spanish soldiers who had already heard that Pike was on his way and had come looking for them. He went down as far as the Arkansas River, and then he traipsed around that region throughout a very tough winter, not really knowing where he was. But by February 1807, Pike was on the Rio Grande and thought he was on the Red River. And there, on the banks of the Rio Grande, he built a 36-foot square fort and raised the American flag on Spanish soil. Pike was ultimately found and arrested by Spanish authorities, who took him to Santa Fe and then on to Chihuahua. In the end, Spanish officials accepted Pike's claim of being in the territory simply because he was lost, and his unit was escorted back to Natchitoches, Louisiana in early July. Nor was Zebulon Pike the only American party to be harassed or arrested by Spanish authorities. Between 1809 and 1821, numerous entrepreneurs sought to exploit the fur riches of the Southwest. Companies led by men such as Regis Loisel, Jacques Clamornan, and Joseph Philibert all ran afoul of Spain's unfavorable trading policies. Manuel Lisa, perhaps believing that his Spanish heritage would favor him with his countrymen, sent a trading venture to Santa Fe in 1812, but it was chased from the territory by rumors of an advancing Spanish military. Robert McKnight's party headed south that same May, but was captured and imprisoned for the next 8 years. A 26-man outfit led by Auguste Chouteau and Jules Dumont was arrested in Santa Fe in 1815. They were released after only 44 days, but their furs and equipment were confiscated. a loss which DeMunn valued at over $30,000. But even in failure, Chouteau and DeMunn had a further impact on that Southwest fur trade. Several of their engagés got a close-up view of the beaver-rich streams of northern New Mexico. Joseph Bissonnette, for example, was among that group. He was an experienced mountaineer, had been with Lisa in 1812. In 1820, Bissonnette served as a guide to the Stephen H. Long expedition, providing a remarkable geographic knowledge of the Rocky Mountains. And though he had seen Santa Fe mostly from the barred window of the local jailhouse, Bissonnette settled there a few years later. Though American trappers and traders were keenly interested in the region, Spain considered the presence a threat to its northern boundaries, northern holdings. After the 1803 purchase of Louisiana by the United States, and considering military expeditions such as those led by Lewis and Clark or Zebulon Pike, the U.S. and its citizens were regarded as trespassers. Strict trade restrictions were instituted to forestall these incursions into the Spanish domain. And such isolationist policies were upheld until Mexico got its independence in 1821, after which time the Southwest became, and now, a potential trading partner for American commercial interests. Now, under this new regime, Mexico's northern colonies were expected to fend for themselves. Santa Fe's best option for acquiring needed goods, though not government approved, was through trade with its U.S. neighbors. Remember, they're just half the distance away. Management of these northern provinces were never easy. In the 25 years of the Mexican Empire's establishment in 1821 until the beginning of the Mexican-American War in 1846, there would be no less than 17 different governors. Now, in that first year of Mexican independence, you've already all heard of William Becknell. He wasted no time in setting out from St. Louis with a mule train of supplies bound for Santa Fe. The overwhelming success of that first venture stirred other U.S. entrepreneurs into action, including 120 American trappers who traveled the Santa Fe Trail in the first 2 years of the new republic. John McKnight, who was Robert's brother, followed close behind Becknell and reached Santa Fe in 1822. He reported that some of his trappers had gone far into the interior of Mexico. The Hugh Glenn and Jacob Fowler party also plied the rivers of the Southwest during that same period. Nonetheless, many of these Americans still met with assorted roadblocks, such as hostile Indians or military persecution, and relatively little successful trapping was done. But in August of 1823, Bartolomé Baca comes on the scene. He was appointed as the Santa Fe governor, and things changed drastically. Baca was born in 1767. He was from an aristocratic family and had lived in New Mexico his entire life. He had been a militia captain and had seen action in numerous clashes with a variety of Native American tribes. Baca had also served as commandant of the local military garrison. But now, as the jefe politico, the equivalent of a territorial governor, Baca recognized that goods introduced by foreign traders and trappers were essential to the survival, much less the prosperity, of his region. American merchandise was cheaper to import, trappers brought money into a cash-strapped economy, and traders gladly accepted beaver pelts from citizens who had no specie. And specie is money in the form of gold and silver coins rather than paper notes. So Baca chose to ignore the federal decrees from Mexico City that barred foreign trappers and anticipated that there would be a fur trade solution to Santa Fe's financial hardships. Mexican goods, pelts, and silver coins were soon making their way regularly to St. Louis. We don't have a picture of Baca. That's as close as I can get. However, under Mexican federal law, to trap legally required permits, but the permits were reserved for its citizens. So Baca cleverly granted licenses to foreigners under the names of residents, stipulating that those local people would apprentice to these experienced trappers. Mexican settlers had spent much of their time prospecting or farming or running the sheep herds and had little, if any, skill in trapping beaver. So Baca wanted the inhabitants of his district to learn the trade so that the province would benefit even greater in the long run. Besides learning the trapping trade, in the years ahead, Mexican citizens would serve as hunters and interpreters. Mexican artisans and laborers would be hired to build several adobe forts along the front range of the Rockies, where Hispanic foreigners formed the mainstay of the unskilled workforce, functioning as muleteers, horse guards, drovers, packers, and extra hands. And these little arrows, here's Fort Laramie and here's Santa Fe, or I'm sorry, that's Bensford, and all these different forts start popping up in the late 1820s, early 1830s, and a lot of them were adobe forts built by Mexican workers. Baca did his best to see that trappers were treated well during his time in office, including occasional intervention in conflicts between trappers and local law enforcement. With a sense of security, many trappers now relocated to Taos or Santa Fe on a permanent basis. They married Mexican women, and they enjoyed a new lifestyle in a far more temperate climate than they would have met in the northern Rockies. Many American trappers also became Mexican citizens, which allowed them to work unencumbered. The new Mexican Constitution allowed for such naturalization upon a person's conversion to Catholicism, which many of the Frenchmen entering the trade already observed. Citizenship could be applied for after 2 years of residency, learning Spanish, and swearing an oath of loyalty to the new nation. Now, as a market for merchandise, Santa Fe was virtually inundated in a very short time. With such an overabundance of goods and cash in short supply, many of these adventurers who had come to New Mexico as traders began stalking the beaver-rich streams of the Southwest. But beaver populations in the area immediately surrounding Santa Fe had already been depleted, so trappers were forced to look farther afield to find worthy streams. Bernard Pratt and Company, also known as the French Company, began exploring the idea of trade with Santa Fe in 1824. Jean-Pierre Cabinet, a partner in the firm, was eager to work out a deal with Etienne Provost, Francois Leclerc, and James Baird, all of whom were known to be trapping in the Southwest. But as it turned out, Cabinet was one step behind his own employee, Joseph Robidoux, who had already dispatched a private trading party to New Mexico. Pratt did finally send a party from St. Louis, and the leader of this brigade was a 22-year-old young man named Saran St. Vrain, who was the nephew of Charles de la Souce, the former lieutenant governor of Louisiana. St. Vrain would later join forces with partners Charles and William Bent to construct Bent's Fort, which many of you have heard of, maybe even visited, which would have a very significant impact on the Southwest. Throughout 1824, at least 6 brigades had attempted to trap the Colorado Basin and northward. Ewing Young and William Wolfskill led a party of American trappers from their Taos base to hunt the San Juan and other branches of the Colorado River. William Houdard and his companions tracked their way from Taos as far north as the Green River. The field was rounded out by teams led by William Becknell, Thomas Pegleg Smith, Etienne Provost, and Antoine Robidoux, these latter two having been part of that Chouteau and Demund failed party 9 years earlier. Provost and his partner, Francois Leclerc, left Taos in the summer of 1824. They had 30 or so men employed, and that crew worked westward from a supply base at the mouth of White River and onto the waters of the Uinta Basin in what is now northeastern Utah. The party had also trapped the Weber River east of the Great Salt Lake near present Mountain Green, Utah. Meanwhile, the brigade led by William Becknell got a late start, leaving Santa Cruz, New Mexico in early November. They headed north towards the Colorado River, known as the Grand back in those days. Becknell may have been the first American to actually receive a Mexican license to trap, but he was back in the settlements just 5 months later, having suffered a miserable winter in the Rocky Mountains. Sometime during that same season, trappers under Antoine Robidoux ran across Provost's party in a camp on the Green River. And when Robidoux went back to Taos in February of 1825, over 24 of Provost's men accompanied him. So with these 3 southwestern brigades in the field, New Mexico-based trappers numbered nearly as many as the St. Louis-based Henry and Ashley Company, which had been operating in the mountains for the last 3 years. Provost actually met up with Ashley and learned that the general had planned a rendezvous with his enterprising young men in just a few weeks. And since Provost clearly knew the area better than Ashley did, the Southwesterner guided both trapping teams to that meeting place. Now this image of ATM Provo, I want you to take a good look at that because I'm going to show you another image soon. This is being bandied around by the Utah Historical Society as coming from a book called Les Voyageurs, but there's no provenance of that book. You can't find that book anywhere, but there it is. That's the picture. But I'm going to show you another one in just a few minutes. So the combined parties of Provo and Ashley arrive at the appointed location on Henry's Fork of the Green River, and his trappers, ATM Provost and his trappers at that first rendezvous demonstrate that Taos is noticeably easy to reach from the Central Rockies. Now this is Provo according to Alfred Jacob Miller. Alfred Jacob Miller met Provo in 1837, described him as a corpus like a porpoise. You can see his little rotundity going on here. And so here's Les Voyageurs, we don't know anything about that. And here is Alfred Jacob Miller, who is the only artist to actually go to a Rocky Mountain rendezvous and has a tremendous catalog of work. There's a great webpage, it's alfredjacobmiller.com, that has most of Alfred Jacob Miller's online, and there's just some fabulous images from the fur trade. So one of the first known records of Anglo travelers on the Gila River, I wanted to point out that this is the current Utah border, and all of these rendezvous are in Mexico territory. Okay. So, and Mexico doesn't learn about that until late 1827. There had already been 3 rendezvous there, and Ute Chief brought information to Taos, and the Taos sent it down to Mexico City that there was all these American trappers around the Mexico territory. Mexico complained to the U.S. consulate, but nothing really happened. So Ashley and all his buddies were able to trap in Mexico territory virtually without any consequence. So one of the first known records of Anglo travelers on the Gila River was kept by James Ohio Patty. He wrote in 1825 that the Gila was a river never before explored by white people. But various Spanish expeditions in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century had certainly crossed or followed portions of what was to become the Gila Trail, or the southern immigrant route to California. Reports brought back to Taos by Patty in the spring of 1826 would start a stampede of trappers to the area by the fall, including ones led by Sir Anne St. Vrain and Michel Robideau. The Robideau family was all over the fur trade. So if you want to learn something about fur trade in the Southwest, just look up Robideau. They're everywhere. Now about this time, Antoine Robideau had learned that, or he had returned back to the mountains in west central Colorado, and there he built a small log cabin that would serve as a trading post, one of the very first trading posts built on the western side of the Continental Divide in the interior of the Rocky Mountain region. It was known as Fort Uncompahgre, and it was located on the south bank of the Gunnison, just a few miles below its confluence with the Uncompahgre. If you're ever over in that area, they've done a very nice job of recreating that fort. It's just right on the Colorado-Utah border there. Though the date of its founding is somewhat obscured, the post does seem to be one of, if not the first, trading establishments that were built west of the Continental Divide. And despite the rugged terrain out there, Robideau supplied this fort with wagon loads of goods. He was the first man to haul freight into the Central Rockies by wheeled vehicles. Now, Bartolomé Baca resigned as governor in September of 1825. So all that we've just talked about is happening between 1823 and 1825. He was succeeded by Antonio Narbona, who at least initially maintained Baca's approach to the foreign trappers in New Mexico. But in late 1826, he expressed his concern to the superiors of Mexico City about a growing transient population in New Mexico provinces. Narbona was convinced that these Anglo-Americans wanted to bypass his jurisdiction and settle in the Mexican interior. From there, he suspected they would carry on an illicit trade, avoiding payments of custom duties, and basically screw over the Mexican government. So Baca's successor reversed the earlier verdicts, making it more and more difficult for trappers to work in the northern provinces of New Mexico. It slowed them down, but it came far from stopping them. So, why are so many Frenchmen, and mostly we're talking about the leaders here. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about the rank and file in our 2 o'clock paper this afternoon. Why so many Frenchmen? It's hard to miss the number of men with French-sounding names who are leading trading and trapping brigades during Baca's term. Just how many of these French Americans also worked in those brigades, men like Gervais Noland, Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, Jean Valliant, Antoine Maroux, and a host of others, we can't really determine. It's hard to derive exact figures, but people with French roots had become a significant presence in the Southwest in the mid-1820s. The impact of some of them was felt for decades. One such figure was Charles Beaubien, a French-Canadian who arrived from Quebec in Santa Fe in 1824. His initial years there were spent chasing beaver throughout the Southwest and as far as to the Pacific coast. By 1829, he had put away the traps, settled in Taos, and opened his own store. That year, Beaubien was granted naturalization as a Mexican citizen, and he changed his name from Charles to Carlos. His business proffered. You got to, do when in Rome, right? When in Santa Fe, do what the Santa Feans do. His local business prospered. He got involved in politics, and by 1834, he was named the first alcalde, or magistrate, basically, of Taos. And it was Senor Beaubien who would regale John Sutter with glorious tales of the wonders of California, igniting an enthusiasm for Sutter's later immigration to the Golden State. So why French? Yale professor Dr. J. Gitlin asserted that being French in the Southwest made a difference in several ways. First, as noted earlier, many of these men were already Catholic. Thus they understood and practiced similar beliefs of the system of the society that they were about to insert themselves into. Second, it was easier for a Frenchman to learn Spanish than it was for people who spoke another language. French and Spanish are both Romance languages, and they share a great deal of vocabulary, morphology, and syntax. France, like Spain, was governed by civil law, not common law, as was England and the United States. But perhaps most important, according to Gitlin, was that the French were survivors. They had already experienced several governmental changes in North America and had learned a degree of cultural flexibility. The French Empire had been taken over by the English sovereignty, which later came under the rule of the American Republic. They had seen Indian country transition to frontier settlements. They had lived through an evolution of Louisianan control that went from French to Spanish, back to French, and finally to American control. And through all of that change, this French community had maintained an ability to adapt, accommodate, and stay focused on an economic agenda. From the early years of the 19th century, and particularly from 1823, when Bartolomé Baca changed the focus of New Mexico's economy, Americans, so many of whom were of French ancestry, spread out over the Southwest in their hunt for beaver pelts, with its roots in permanent New Mexican settlements like Taos and Santa Fe. The fur trade brought a substantial income into Baca's province. Boston entrepreneur Nathaniel Wyeth estimated that of the 683 packs of beaver fur arriving in St. Louis in 1832 and 1833, 150 of those came from the Santa Fe region, almost 22%. By comparison, another contemporary estimate reported that 1/3 of the furs finding their way to American markets during that same period derived from trappers based in the Southwest. Bartolomé Baca's ingenuity and enthusiasm opened the door between nations and cultures. And though he was governor for only a short time, from 1823 to 1825, he played a critical role in offering New Mexicans a means to pursue trapping while attracting needed tradesmen and artisans to the territory. And so often, it was the French who were at the forefront of American expansion, pursuing a variety of economic opportunities which started with beaver pelts. Thank you. Merci beaucoup.